So over the 4th of July weekend, all 3 of my daughters and their husbands and all 5 of my grandchildren came to Tucson, where we celebrated together our July birthdays with a great big dino bash. What can I say? I guess everybody loves dinosaurs. So when I got there, the kids all had dinosaur bathing suits, and the adults had dinosaur shorts or shirts, and I got a t-shirt that had on the front of it, Grammysaurus, with all 5 of the grandkids' names down below it. And so everybody entered into this spirit of the party fully. The pictures are pretty wonderful. And as I looked at each one of those precious grandchildren, who now range from 4 to 13, I started thinking about the day that they were born and the miracle of each of their births, the long past miracle of each of their mother's births. When I remember thinking, there you are. What were you doing inside for all of those months? And so the words of our scripture today took on new meaning. For it was you, God, who formed my inward parts. You stitched me together in my mother's womb. And I pondered then how each child grew from a hoped-for dream of his or her parents to this real flesh and blood, bone and muscles, and those long, skinny fingers of a newborn, those really cute little ears. And then I was reminded of these words: my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth, and your eyes beheld my unformed substance. And I wanted to shout for each of my grandchildren the day that they were born, you are perfect. And yet that acclamation, I think, paled in comparison to their parents, you are perfect, which pales in comparison to God's acclamation for every single one of us on the day that we were born. You are perfect. My hope for each one of those young ones from that very first birthday was that one day they would be able to pray and play and pray with the psalmist, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And as we all know, context changes how we read biblical texts. So each birth in our own families and the circle of our friends highlights God's deep relationship with those children from the very beginning, and even before that, and then from that day forward. As a church, we celebrate children when they are baptized, and we make promises as a church body to nurture them and to love them. So the words of this psalm are similarly powerful for all of us who are well beyond our own day of birth, to recall our own humble beginnings, and God's intimate involvement in that dawning is to pray aloud with the psalmist, "O Lord, you have searched me, and you have known me." Now, there are some people who struggle with a fear of really being known, even as they desire to be known. And some go to great lengths to not be known by hiding their true identities, even, or maybe even especially, from God. So we really can't assume that verse 7 is received as good news for everyone. That verse says, "Where can I go from your spirit?" Or, "Where can I flee from your presence?" So the Hebrew poets, knowing that there might have been somewhat of a different way of understanding those words, made sure to highlight that their God was not one so high and mighty like all the gods of those neighboring worshipers, that the people could not know God and be known fully and wonderfully. So this direct and intimate relationship is demonstrated in this psalm that uses the Hebrew root word yada over and over again. Now, whenever you heard yada, 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 did you know that was Hebrew? Now you have one bit of knowledge ahead of anyone else who might use that phrase. But yada is a pointing to a kind of knowing that has a level of certainty, of not only familiarity, but of confidence in that relationship. So, knowing that we are made in the image of God, are we willing to take the time to stitch and weave those kinds of relationships throughout our lives? In a book titled Tales of the Hasidim, Martin Buber, who was an early 20th century Jewish philosopher, offered these words concerning the relationship between God and humankind. So he wrote, "Where I wander, you. Where I ponder, you. Only you, you again, always you, 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 you. When I am gladdened, you. When I am saddened, you. Only you, you again, always you, 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 you. Sky is you, earth is you, you above, you below, in every trend, at every end, only you. You again, always you, 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 you." So good relationships are vital to our well-being. I mean, how often have you heard the phrase, "It's not what you know, it's who you know," or "You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours," or the words quid pro quo, or the words I heard this morning from someone coming into worship, "We love your sermons, Reverend Candace, but really, it's the people we come to see." In China, all three of those expressions are summed up in one word, two characters, gu wan qi. So for those who like to visualize, Guanxi, gu wan qi. So if a person in business wants his or her enterprise to succeed, gu wan qi is very important in smoothing the way, getting favors, acquiring permits, and so on. If something doesn't work out, well, there must have been a gu wan qi problem. It's important to develop relationships, to build networks with possible benefactors. It's invaluable as well for others to know of one's own business and skill sets so that one might then have the opportunity to return favors. So the relevant question for any person, Western or Chinese, doing business in China is, how much gu wan qi do you have? In simple terms, gu wan qi appears to carry an element of trust, of goodwill back and forth between people. So it's true that a lot of business in China revolves around circles of personal and mutual trust. So for any outsider to do business in China, they have to take time to form relationships, or gu wan qi. Frankly, that's been a big obstacle for many Western businesses who have tried to enter the Chinese market. Business connections that are made through this gu wan qi have to be maintained so that you have proper positioning for future business endeavors. So then one might ask, well, how can good gu wan qi be created, be maintained? Well, we Western types, we tend to think that this kind of relationship is based on direct cash exchanges. I'll give you this, you give me this back in return. And although that is correct on some levels, that really isn't the norm today. Often, gu wan qi transactions are hidden. They're not made obvious to the casual observer. Although the direct giving of gifts is a common form of building gu wan qi, it isn't the only way. So we find inviting or hosting business dinners for prospective clients or business partners, that can create an environment for guanxi. Just like when we do things here at the church, like dinners for 8 to build fellowship, we're building guanxi as a faith community. Also, the exchange of favors or inside information might also lead to good guanxi. But not all guanxi is good guanxi. So we've discovered that relationships that are built this way can quickly fade or disappear if part of the relationship chain is put in question. And this reminds me of being in grade school. Did you ever have a best friend one day and then they wouldn't talk to you the next? Right? I mean, like guanxi is at work from the time we're really, really young. There's a fine line in the business world, evidently, between guanxi and actual bribery. So the path to good guanxi isn't an easy one to follow. It's like walking into a thick mist where you constantly just sort of have to feel your way to where you're going. But knowing God and God knowing us, I would say that is really good guanxi. But sometimes guanxi can be somewhat confusing if we're not listening carefully, as in the following case. This guy was pulled over for running a stop sign. And when the cop checked his driver's license, he said, "You're not wearing your glasses on your ID, and you're not now. I'm going to have to give you a ticket for that." And the guy said, "Officer, I have contacts." And the cop said, "Look, buddy, I don't care who you know. I'm giving you a ticket." Ooh, that was a groaner? Yeah. As the Edward Snowden case unfolded, you might remember the National Security Agency became notorious for what came to be known as data mining, and its dogged accumulation of unimaginable quantities of personal information about Americans, especially mobile phone data. So I had this vision of Psalm 139's conception of God's involvement in human life exceeding even that. God is our intimate, constant companion, the one who knows what we're thinking even before we think it. So we might ask, well then, is that a good thing? Well, some of us might say yes. Others of us might say no. On the one hand, a God who knows our every thought can be a powerful source of strength and comfort. And as it says later in the psalm, there is no place we can go, not even to the farthest limits of the sea, which would have been one of the most terrifying destinations for desert-dwelling Hebrews. Can't even go that far that God is not present to guide and support. Now, on the other hand, constant divine scrutiny can have its downside. I mean, is there no privacy, no freedom? Are we never allowed to savor our guilty pleasures free from the scrutiny of that all-seeing eye? As Homer Simpson once said to God, "You're everywhere. You're omnivorous." With that level of awareness, could God devour us too? Well, I think we'd all respond, of course not, because packaged along with the doctrine of divine omniscience, the idea that God is everywhere, is the doctrine of divine benevolence, that God is always desiring our good. So the psalmist doesn't find the thought of God's intimate knowledge disturbing in the least. Quite the contrary. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is so high that I cannot attain it. Remarkably, the psalmist affirms divine omniscience, I keep wanting to say omnivorousness, as wonderful, even though he can't begin to comprehend how that works. So while we might be tempted to flee from God, to ignore God's knowledge of us, and to discount it, And the fact is that God lets us do that. We discover eventually that that doesn't change God's interest in our lives, in our hearts, in our very beings. There's a rabbinic story about a child who tried to flee from God, specifically refusing to study the Talmud. So to put that in modern day terms, it's like a kid who doesn't want to come to Sunday school. Just saying. And his parents, in desperation, called the rabbi. And the day the rabbi was to come, the child cowered in terror, and he heard the sound of the heavy boots on the stairs. And when the parents opened the door, a deep voice roared, "Where is the boy who refuses to study Talmud?" Well, the parents, a little intimidated themselves, shrank back, and the rabbi ordered them out of their apartment. And the huge bearded man loomed over the shivering and shaking child, and then he picked the boy up, sat down in a chair, and gently folded the boy to his chest. And the boy's terror gave way to a feeling of peace. And in time, the child's own heartbeat matched that of the rabbi. After about an hour, one of the most peaceful hours the boy had ever known, the parents hesitantly knocked on the door of their own apartment. The rabbi set the child down, looked into his eyes, and winked. And then he stomped over to the door. Violently, he pulled the door open and yelled, "Now the child will study Talmud." And he did. In time, he became a famous rabbi himself. And one day, his own students asked him how he had come to love the Talmud so much. And it was then that he told them of the day when the rabbi had picked him up and held him close to his heart. When was the last time that you let yourself be held close to the heart of God? You'll have an opportunity in a moment during our prayer time to sit in silence with God, to let God fully embrace you as you are, to open your heart to the one who knows you and loves you. And in the process, you may not feel very loved or worthy or that you really want to be held by God. Maybe you think somewhere along the lines of the legendary Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, who was once asked, "Are you ready to meet your maker?" In typical pithy response, Churchill replied, "I am ready to meet my maker. Whether he is ready for the ordeal of meeting me is another matter entirely." But ordeal or not, God is ready to be with you, to hold you close, to revel in you. And when you feel God holding your life, knowing that there is nowhere that you can go that God doesn't care about you, you begin caring about others in the same way. And brothers and sisters in Christ, when we desire to love and to hold others in the way that God holds us, then we begin to see the world in a whole new way. That we're children of God, all of us, intertwined and known and loved. You see, we need God and we need each other. And where can we possibly go to get away from that knowledge? Absolutely nowhere.